How can the Syrian war be stopped? With no end to the conflict in sight, we're asking if 3 rounds of international peace talks have actually achieved anything. Also in today's program, digging up Bangladesh's dark past. With another Jamaati Islami leader set to be hanged for war crimes, his supporters call for a nationwide strike. And in Picture This, off the wall and off the page, Google brings painting into the 3rd dimension. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. 5 years of war has crippled Syria, killing hundreds of thousands and fracturing the country almost beyond recognition. It's exposed ethnic and religious fault lines, and as the war drags on, the separation only seems to get further. Despite 3 rounds of official peace talks in Geneva, the opposition and regime appear no closer to resolving their differences. Last month's cessation of hostilities brought the longest period of calm since the war began, raising hope that it could lead to a lasting ceasefire. But it, like the peace talks, has ended with no clear way forward. Today's newsmaker then is Syria, as we ask whether talks can bring peace to the country.
Five years of war, 4 years of failed talks, negotiations, ceasefires, broken promises, and no real progress towards an end to the Syrian conflict.
The people of Syria want peace and hope, yet all they see is death upon death. All they hear is talk after talks.
Another week, another city, renewed efforts to reignite the flagging peace talks. The foreign ministers of Turkey, Britain and the Gulf states are meeting some of the Syrian opposition in Paris. The aim is simple: saving the peace talks for another round later in the month and easing the plight of people in Syria. The signs currently are not good, but when have they been?
The government will have to be formed through discussion, negotiations, and by mutual consent.
Syrian parties are now coming together to achieve a political settlement.
The regime came but has no intention to implement the Geneva I communique.
The only plan B available is return to war.
But this is the reality across Syria today. Bombed out landscapes across much of the country, uninhabitable towns and cities, and a seemingly direct intention by the regime to target hospitals and public services, draining areas of support. The situation in Aleppo in particular is precarious. And as the conflict enters its 6th year, the death toll has passed 400,000. 11 million people have been displaced.
If Assad does not adhere to this, there will clearly be repercussions, and one of them may be the total destruction of the ceasefire, and they go back to war.
And how do you make progress against the unyielding will of the two sides who are due to talk again? Bashar al-Assad's version of peace is a national unity government which he would still lead. The opposition refuses to accept anything that does not include the ousting of Assad. The Syrian regime, though, is insistent that Assad's fate should not even be on the table. And while politicians scramble to keep negotiations alive, hundreds of thousands in Syria continue to suffer. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the future of Syria's faltering peace process, our Syrian freelance journalist and Middle East analyst Sharif Nashashibi and Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University Max Abrahms. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Sharif, let me start with you. Do you think that Staffan de Mistura, John Kerry, the opposition leaders and others have all been wasting their time recently, given what's going on the ground?
Yes, the peace process has been a failure from the get-go. And unfortunately, despite the obvious nature of that, we keep seeing a repetition of the same broken formula in this peace process. There are 2 main pitfalls here. One is that throughout the process, there is a deliberate attempt to sideline any discussion about the fate of Bashar Assad. The other issue is the lack of accountability. There is no mechanism for a referral of the conflict to the International Criminal Court. And without accountability, there is every possibility, not only that the conflict will continue, but that it could recur at any moment afterwards.
Okay,
because there is no
Sharif, let me
justice
just
being
jump
faced
in there.
by any side of this conflict.
Why not have peace without discussing the fate of Assad and perhaps having him in some role, even if it's symbolic, if it brings about peace? Why not?
Because Assad is the crux of the conflict. The reason the conflict started is because people were fed up with decades of the Assad dynasty dictating over Syria. You can't just sideline this issue. He is the reason why the conflict is going on now. So to have a peace process where he is not even discussed is absolutely absurd.
Max Abrahms, Assad has to go first and foremost. What do you think?
I think that it's very simplistic to say that Assad is at the root of this problem, and therefore, if Assad goes, everything is going to go swimmingly in Syria. As you know, Islamic State didn't start in Syria. It migrated to Syria, but not just Syria. Islamic State has metastasized all over the world. So this is a group that is increasingly showing a presence in Yemen, in the Sinai, in Libya, throughout Europe, throughout Nigeria. These are all places without Assad. Terrorists, they tend to thrive most under one condition, and that is a condition of a power vacuum. To a large extent, Islamic State was actually created because we removed the leader of an important country. When we removed Saddam Hussein, there was not Islamic State. There was not even the predecessor, Al-Qaeda, in Iraq. It was only when we removed that leader that the conditions became ripe for the terrorism threat to grow. And so the notion that we should combat Islamic State essentially in the exact same way that created Islamic State seems to me to suffer from a logical problem.
Okay, Sharif, the likes of Assad are the lesser evil when you compare them to Daesh.
Sorry, the regime, Assad at its helm, is responsible for the vast majority of the death and destruction in that country. And Max, I need to correct you here. Nouri Maliki, the former Iraqi prime minister, publicly complained, and he was an ally of Assad, publicly complained to the Assad regime that the regime was facilitating the entry into Iraq of jihadists who formed part of the core leadership of ISIS and other Islamist groups, jihadist groups in Iraq. So the Assad regime was complicit in the rise of ISIS in Iraq, who then entered Syria from there. So I'm sorry, you can't divorce one from the other. And the fact of the matter is, the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other similar organizations differs from country to country. And in Syria, you cannot escape the fact that there would be no ISIS foothold or Al-Qaeda foothold if the regime did not react the way that it did by killing civilians who were simply wanting the same rights that me and you, Max, take for granted.
Okay, Max, the man bears the brunt, bears the greatest responsibility for the best part of more than 300,000 dead. Surely he needs to face some sort of accountability?
Well, I mean, I approach this whole question of what to do with Assad from the perspective of an American, not from a Syrian. If I were a Syrian, it's quite possible, depending on where I'm located in my beliefs and background, that I would be in favor of removing Assad. I understand that. But from the perspective of U.S. national security, frankly, I'm much more worried about the kinds of groups that Assad is fighting against in Syria than I am of Assad himself. Assad is at war with many different groups and entities in Syria. They range from being quite moderate to being as extreme as you could get. So when I see Assad, going after Nusra, going after Islamic State, going after Al-Qaeda's friends, these are the kinds of groups that have continuously, over the past couple years, exhibited interest in striking the United States.
Okay,
so
who are the good guys,
it's important for me to point out.
Sure, you said they range from one end to the other. Who are the good guys?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm not going to say that the entire Syrian opposition is extreme. That's ridiculous. Of course, there are many, many civilians who are being adversely affected. That's true not just in rebel areas, but also in government areas. And some of the rebel groups, there are literally hundreds of rebel groups, some of them don't want anything to do with Nusra. And some of them are quite helpful against Islamic State. So what we need to do first off is to separate out the rebels from the extremists and then unify against the extremists in Syria.
And you don't think that's being done right now, Max?
No, I don't think it's being done. The reality is that Nusra is very much a powerful and leading rebel group. And we need to encourage other rebel groups to disassociate themselves from Al-Qaeda.
Okay, Sharif, disassociating the rebel groups from Al-Qaeda, passing them out and supporting the good guys.
This is a sideshow. Max is looking at effect and not cause. And since he was talking about an American perspective, let's take an American perspective. If you look at the American invasion of Iraq, this allowed Al-Qaeda to become as powerful as it did in Iraq. And yet the Americans at the time were saying, actually, the problem in Iraq is Al-Qaeda. No, it wasn't Al-Qaeda. It was the American invasion that caused the rise of Al-Qaeda. And what you're doing, Max, is exactly the same thing in Syria. You are focusing only on the effect and not the cause. They wouldn't have a foothold in Syria without the Assad regime. And yet you're saying we have to cooperate and work with the Assad regime. May I also, but hold on, let me finish because I haven't interrupted you.
The cause is regime change.
I have not interrupted you, so let me finish. Max, you told Al Jazeera America that the Geneva process was not what was, in order for it to succeed, Assad had to be weakened. That's what you told Al Jazeera America. So this is quite an about turn from you, that you think that we should rehabilitate a regime that is guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The UN said that it amounts to extermination in February. This is what they said. How can we possibly work with a regime that has committed all this death and destruction to its own people?
Max, the Russians and the Syrians don't seem to be doing that triage as forensically as perhaps everybody would like them to be doing it. They're not really separating out all these groups. They're bombing them all of the groups that are in opposition to Bashar al-Assad. Do you want more or less Russian involvement in supporting Bashar al-Assad? And maybe I'll just extend that to the Iranians as well. More or less Russian and Iranian involvement, in your opinion?
Sure, well, I think that there are trade-offs. It's not entirely clear. I agree with you that I like the way you put it. The Russians are not as concerned about collateral damage as, say, the United States is. The United States runs hundreds and hundreds of sorties without actually dropping any munitions because we're more leery about harming the civilian population. The Assad regime, the Syrian Arab Army, and the Russians, they're not as concerned about collateral damage. And of course, this is very, very negative. So I wish that they had the same target selection as the United States does. That said, let's imagine a scenario where Iran and the Russians were not propping up Assad at all. Would that be better? My colleague that I'm debating today certainly believes that we would be much better off in Syria without this external support for Assad, because then presumably he would be gone. However, I do not have this sanguine of a view that if Assad were to go, Syria would make a transition in the direction that we want.
Okay.
I think that most likely the alternative to Assad would be Al-Qaeda and Islamic State.
Okay, the alternative to Assad is Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Let me just build on that, Sharif. You would, I would presume, want less Russian involvement, less Iranian involvement, or no involvement whatsoever, and more constructive American involvement, wouldn't you, Sharif?
It is foreign involvement in the conflict that has made the conflict as intense and prolonged as it has. And we need to deconstruct this simplistic binary narrative that the Middle East is faced with two choices: either eternal dictatorship or jihadist groups. I'm sorry, this revolution in Syria, the Arab Spring in general, didn't start because people wanted jihadist rule over dictatorship or vice versa. It was because people reject both camps. They don't want to be run by radical extremists. They don't want to be run by dictatorial extremists either. So this is the refuge of every dictator who says, if you challenge my rule, then the alternative will be the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. The people of the Middle East deserve another option, and we don't do them any service by saying, well, you have to choose between this or that. The fact that we continue with this narrative makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the fact that Russia and Iran and others have backed the regime as it has is the very reason why groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have risen to the prominence that they have. Even Putin, Assad's primary ally, said that the situation in Syria would be very different had the regime reacted differently to popular protests from the start.
Okay. As I wrap this up, Max, let me ask you about Aleppo. We've seen more than 200 people die in the past week alone in Aleppo. Some awful scenes coming through there. Do you believe that this war might be decided in Aleppo?
Well, I think Aleppo is a microcosm of the conflict. You have a lot of the key players are there. You have the government, you have the rebels, you have a very strong Nusra, leadership role. And I think that it's a microcosm in the sense that we're basically struggling with the question of who are terrorists and who are not. Clearly, the Assad regime views the vast majority of these fighters as terrorists, whereas the Sunni majority countries and much of, frankly, even Europe are much more in support of helping out these rebels who, in their view, are much more terrorism-free. My own view is that the rebels are very tightly laced with Al-Qaeda, and that we will not see progress until we're better able to separate the moderates from these extremists.
Okay, Sharif, the rebels are not Jeffersonian Democrats. They're Al-Qaeda laced, according to Max Abrahams. And Aleppo is crucially important. Final thoughts from you, Sharif.
You can't discuss the issue of terrorism in the conflict without not only looking also at state terrorism, which is the primary cause of terrorism in the country. If you take a definition of terrorism, which is the deliberate targeting of civilians, then the regime is responsible for terrorism on a much larger scale. So you can't just divorce the regime from the terrorism that is taking place in the country. They are the ones dropping barrel bombs on civilians, starving civilians. This is terrorism on a mass scale. So you have to look at that. You can't just focus on groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS in separation from the regime. They are the primary cause of terrorism. The solution cannot be that the Middle East has to live eternally with dictators from Gaddafi to Bashar Assad to Saddam Hussein. The people of the region deserve better than that, and they deserve better than these jihadists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word. Gentlemen, it's been passionate and civil. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Max Abrahams and Sharif Nashashibi. Still to come on the Newsmakers, a key moment for Bangladesh as the country prepares to execute an opposition leader for war crimes. And in Picture This, letting your imagination run free, we take a look at the latest VR painting experience. Supporters of Bangladesh's Jamaat Islami have held protests after their leader lost his final appeal against the death sentence. Mutiur Rahman Nizami has been convicted of committing war crimes during Bangladesh's War of Independence in 1971. He's the fourth member of the party to be given the death penalty since the government set up a war crimes tribunal 6 years ago. The Newsmakers' Duncan Crawford reports.
It's a verdict that's been celebrated and condemned. A decision that's likely to result in one of Bangladesh's main religious leaders being hanged. Mutiur Rahman Nizami is the leader of the banned Jamaat Islami party. Convicted of war crimes during the 1971 Independence War, he's expected to be executed. The last time death sentences were handed down to members of his party, violence broke out across Bangladesh. Found guilty of genocide, rape and torture, Motiyar Rahman Nizami's already been in jail for 6 years. The former government minister was sentenced to death, along with other members of Jamaat-e-Islami, by a war crimes tribunal in 2014. The convictions were linked to crimes committed during Bangladesh's war for independence from Pakistan. The 1971 war was short but devastating. Authorities in Bangladesh say Pakistani soldiers, aided by people such as Nizami, killed up to 3 million people and raped 200,000 women. The conflict led to the former East Pakistan breaking away to form Bangladesh. Many have celebrated Nizami's conviction. And after the Supreme Court upheld his death sentence last week, prosecutors say Nizami will soon be hanged.
The death penalty is kept for Mr. Motiyar Rahman Nizami. Now it is time for all of us to wait when the execution takes place.
Critics say the case against Nizami is politically motivated, that the Prime Minister is using the tribunal to target him and other opponents. Only a presidential pardon will now save Nizami, and that's unlikely. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the controversy surrounding Bangladesh's War Crimes Tribunal is Lisa Curtis from the Heritage Foundation. She's in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Lisa. Will this be justice served when he's executed?
Well, look, this is happening in an extremely politically polarized environment in Bangladesh, going back to the 2014 elections in which the opposition did not even participate. The international community deemed these elections flawed. So we essentially have one-party rule in Bangladesh right now. That's the first problem. Meanwhile, you have the International Crimes Tribunal occurring. It's very controversial. Several human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have raised concerns about the process, have indicated that it is politically motivated. The defendants have not had the opportunity to make their cases. It's heavily weighted towards the prosecution. In fact, one of the justices had to resign from the trial's process in 2012 because it was leaked that he admitted in a Skype interview that he was under pressure from the government to make the prosecutions quickly.
Might this be a bit of both, where this guy is clearly guilty for rape and murders in 1971, war crimes, but on the other hand, Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League is using this conveniently to embark on a political witch hunt and clear out the opposition? Might it be a bit of both?
Well, I think that's entirely possible. And there's a reason that these war crimes trials have not been held for the last 45 years. People knew that they would be controversial, that this would expose the fault lines in Bangladeshi society, cause further divisions in society. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening. And, you know, this combined with the fact that you don't have the opposition participating in the political process. You had political protests a year ago. Over 120 people were killed in those protests. Thousands of opposition leaders were thrown into jail. There have been complaints about media freedoms being curtailed under the Sheikh Hasina government. So in this, you know, polarized environment, I think it's very difficult for these trials to be seen as credible. Now, there may be a political demand. You know, Sheikh Hasina supporters certainly are supporting these trials, and in fact, they have called for the execution of the Jamaat-e-Islami leaders allegedly accused of war crimes. But I think that the fact remains that there are questions within the international community about the process, and therefore there have been calls for the Sheikh Hasina government to slow down the process and to refrain from carrying out these executions, which have been extremely controversial.
Lisa Curtis from Washington, D.C., thank you very much for giving us your thoughts. Looking forward to chatting to you sometime soon. In today's Picture This, Google has just revealed its new Tilt Brush. It's a device that allows you to paint in 3D space using virtual reality technology. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been Syria, as we asked whether peace talks could bring an end to the war. There have been multiple attempts to bring the sides together, but for now they appear as far apart as they ever have been. While the latest round of peace talks managed to achieve a moment of relative calm for Syria's civilians, that now seems dead in the water. It has been hard to resolve even the smallest issues between the sides, let alone the fate of Bashar al-Assad or the way forward for the country. Those fractures are reflected in the international community, and while that continues, there can be little hope of lasting peace. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.